Greetings, everyone. This is Virtuous Roots, where we reclaim virtue to bring it to our home and yours. And I'm Thomas McCuddy.
I'm Thomas Quackenbush.
And I'm Nick Wiegand. And tonight we're talking about, we're asking the question, should we teach kids to defend the faith? And it's interesting because I was reading today about a atheist who was challenging some, famous Christian YouTubers, and they released some of the emails. And one of the things that he was challenging was the idea of indoctrinating your children into the faith. And it was a challenge against the idea of indoctrination. When the reality is, when we train our children in the ways in which our families operate, it's less indoctrination and more creating functioning human beings for society. So I don't think the conversation really needs to be, should we raise our kids Christian, but really, do we teach them to defend the faith? The problem is I think they're going to blend together. And so I think we really are going to talk about both. So what is the reason to teach someone to defend their faith initially?
Part of it's going to be the defense comes from knowing why you believe, which I think is what mitigates against things like indoctrination, because the claim of indoctrination is that they've only been told one thing and they just kind of accept it, and you pour in and they pop out whatever it is, and they become conduits. So that's actually completely opposite of what we should be doing in Christianity. We should be giving the reasons for this hope that was within us. This is one of the things, Norm Geisler wrote a book on the apologetics of Jesus and how he would regularly demonstrate his power for that purpose of proving who he was, that he said he was. He didn't just say it and accept my word. He was like, even when the Pharisees, when the religious leaders were mad when he told the guy who was let down from the roof, and he says your sins are forgiven, and they got all upset, and he's like, so that you know that I can do this, let me do the harder thing, get up and walk. The guy got up and walked and verified what he said. So for us, the whole idea is we need to know, why is it we believe these things? If we're going to say that God is all loving, how do we know that? If we're going to say that Jesus is God, where do we get that from Scripture? How do we understand these things? And it allows us to engage the counter arguments, so that, again, this goes opposite of indoctrination. It's like, no, we're going to lay out, here's what people are saying, but here's the fallacy in the reasoning. Here's the misinformation. Here's these kinds of components. And so,
well, by teaching them to defend, you're teaching them the faith, but also what you just brought up, you have to teach them logic. You have to teach them the ideas of conversation and debate. They have to understand even the arguments that are going to come against them.
Yeah. Because I've noticed, especially working with teenagers, that, they're hearing all kinds of things from their friends that might not be, even believing friends that, maybe have some confusion about certain things or some social issues. And I think that's a really big problem, because we're seeing all these things coming up, and there's this constant inundation of all these different problems, these different, what we're teaching. Is it wrong to do this, or is it right to do this? And, is it unloving to do this? And so they're like, my kids, they engage this stuff all the time, and they're asking me questions of how to deal with a lot of this stuff, because, they want to be able to give a reasonable answer to their friends, because they know, from living in our home, that Christianity is true, and they know that I teach the Bible, and they want to be able to take that information and be able to convey it to their friends and maybe people out there that are, questioning their faith or having difficulties, kind of just dealing with all the different things going on in the society today. I think it's really important. I think my kids just naturally want to have that kind of understanding so that they can have these conversations with people that are around them.
So one thing that you had just said, and then you kind of piggybacked on it, was you drew the comparison between indoctrination and this idea of defense of the faith. Well, I know, when I started Bible college, I had to take a apologetics class, which is what pushed me into majoring in apologetics. Thomas, you were my professor. And what it did for me was it emboldened my faith, and it really gave me
Mm-hmm.
something to grasp onto. But what you had just brought up about this idea of indoctrination is, what goes in is what comes out, and it's just a conduit. And so I just Googled it, and so the often cited statistics is between 60 to 75% of Christian youth stop regular attendance after high school. So we have this huge epidemic of our Christian children leaving the faith. And I kind of want to draw it back to what you said earlier. It sounds like that. I think the main reason that that's happening is because many parents are actually only indoctrinating their kids, is they're creating them as if they're just these little parrots
Mm-hmm.
and giving them no ability to think on their own or think through it.
Mhm.
And I think there's some, because what I've noticed about some of the church family, like the people that, like, we kind of make our church a little bubble, and the kids maybe never engage. They want to, filter everything that's, considered worldly out of their, attention, which in some ways that's good. But when they're out into the world and they start experiencing things, they don't know what to do with that. And I think that a lot of times, like, if they, as part of Thomas and I, and Families of Virtue itself, we talk about that as well, because is the truth really in them, or are they just doing this, or are they waiting out their time until they can get and make their own decisions? Um, like maybe at some point in their lives, as they're trying to, grow up and differentiate themselves from their parents, they, that faith goes with it, because it's just my parents' faith. It's just what they believe. I want to believe something different, or I have my own beliefs or whatever.
So this idea of making it their own, I think one of the other, so what the reasons I think that parents avoid this in the first place is there's big swaths in the church afraid of apologetics. Like that's a big word that people are like, oh, you just like to argue.
Mm-hmm.
It's really nothing about it that's not what it's about. But I think another portion is when we look at our kids and we say, okay, they're Christians and I want them to stay Christians in this purely secular world. I'm afraid to expose them to the arguments against the faith. So I'm afraid to expose them to the ideas that, well, the virgin birth seems impossible in natural law. The idea that, well, there's the idea that books were taken out of the Bible and then there were things added into the Bible. The idea of, well, resurrecting bodies, that's an impossible thing. So there has to be a problem with that. The problem with evil, all of the big questions that come at us when people start to question the faith, we don't want to expose our kids to that. I think parents they think, well, if I expose my kid to that, maybe they'll leave the faith when they hear it.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we as parents prepare our kids by giving them these real world examples, preparing them to have an answer, to have a reason? But before I let you go, I want to read Deuteronomy 6, and I'm going to start with verse 5. It says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and you shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on doorposts of your house and on your gates."
Mm-hmm.
And we know that there's people that still do these literally.
Mhm.
But in our current Christian homes, many Christians don't do these literally, but they need to at least continue this idea. So how do we take this, the idea of just pouring scripture into our kids, as well as balancing real world arguments against the faith and preparing them and teaching them to defend it?
I think what gets me is that there's so many different things revolving around this that I could easily just go after that are so near and dear to my heart. Because sticking with Deuteronomy, the whole idea of the conversations, and
Mm-hmm.
if you're gonna train your kids and talking about these issues, I think we can hit several of these issues all at once. A lot of parents don't feel like they know enough. And that's one of the reasons we don't end up doing this. And it's one of the reasons we shy away from apologetics. And so many people And I know this even at the Bible college. People view my classes as the hardest.
So
you know.
an argument of ignorance. We shouldn't do this because I don't know what I'm doing.
Well, and or they don't feel capable. They don't feel like, I can't run with those kinds of things. My elevator doesn't go that high up. And these are things I've heard people say, and having those conversations with your kids, you can journey with them. You don't have to be the master teacher. You don't have to be the kind of person that has all the answers. As you're engaging your kids, ask you a question, you can look at them and say, I do not have an answer right now that will satisfy you, but let me do some work on that. Let me get back to you. And then you have those conversations later. And there's no way to really be prepared for all the possible misunderstandings and objections and the ways people get things wrong and the bad ideas that are out there. Those are potentially infinite. You can keep making up new bad stuff every day.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is why training in the truth is so critical. And I always go back to what Norman Geisler said, and I got to hear him live say this in class, that when you're dealing with counterfeits, the professionals, they don't spend all their time studying all the counterfeits. They study the real deal. And by studying the real deal, when you come across some new counterfeit, you're going to recognize it as counterfeit. And so this is why understanding our faith, growing in these areas, having these conversations, this is where, as your kids bring up something and you think to yourself, I have never thought of this before ever. Where has this come from? Is this a new TikTok thing? What's happened here? To be the kind of person, and we talk about virtue, to have the kind of fortitude that you don't freak out when you hear it, but to honestly, and I think this goes back to the issue, to honestly be able to entertain the idea, to examine it, to identify why this is wrong, and then to be able to address it with your kids.
Yeah.
I think a lot of parents knee jerk and they just get real upset and they just, no, stay away, bad ideas. Forget it. Let's not talk of these things.
Just kind of sweep it under the rug.
And so, again, I spent 15 years in youth ministry, and this is what I saw over and over. And it's been my heart to cry out to parents to say, if you're going to disciple your children and you're going to grow in the faith, sometimes you might have to walk together.
Yeah.
You may not be the one who's necessarily leading, but you're the one who at least can be the motivation to go forward.
Yeah.
And that's part of our job as parents. And that's why for the parents who, they look at me and they're like, well, I've got the doctorate of ministry in apologetics. I specifically did it because I wanted to learn. I wanted to know these things. That's one way, but you don't have to have a doctorate in order to be proficient.
Yeah.
But my question though is like, you brought something up and all I can think of is I can hear the echo in my head of, well, if you're the youth minister or family pastor or whatever the word is, isn't it your job to teach them these things? And so I can just hear the echo in my head of parents saying, no, wait, you're right. You should teach my children how to defend the faith.
See, this is why I have to hold back because my sound guy is going to yell at me for yelling.
No yelling.
It's the reality. I think what you're hitting on is with churches, we look to the church to provide these programs and we outsource to the church for an hour, 2 hours.
Same way parents
3 hours
outsource education to the government.
Well, yeah, but when you outsource to the school and to the government, the kids are there for 6, 7, 8 hours if they're doing sports and everything else.
Yeah.
So the true discipler many times is going to be the school. The school has your kids more than you do in many cases. So the battle has to wage, like you have to be more effective in dealing with your kids, and handing them off to the church is not necessarily, and many times not the best idea, because even all that I did as a youth pastor, when I would even like have kids over at my house and I would basically have meals with them to have these conversations, like literally kind of doing what Deuteronomy said. First of all, that's not my primary job. Like I should be an auxiliary. I should be coming alongside the parents, and that's what the church should be, is an auxiliary. and should provide that help. So you've got a pastor that's had specialized training. You have a pastor who knows the Greek, who knows the Hebrew. You have someone you can go and you can trust, you can ask those questions. That's awesome. But don't just throw them at the church and hope for the best. And it's up to the parents, and then the whole idea of engaging this, again, the numbers, for every 10 kids, we only retain 2 or 3 kids out of, and my numbers weren't even much better than the average youth pastor. This was a part of my story and how I ended up getting into the whole concept of virtue.
Right.
Is like, why am I losing these kids? I taught them. We went through the book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. That's the hot thing right now. Everybody's talking about that book. It's an awesome book. 21 years old this year.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's been out for a while. Okay. So I took them through that. I taught them how to study the Bible. Like I did legit hermeneutics, the same thing I did at the Bible college. I took them and I did all this stuff, and they were still leaving because even as much as I poured in the knowledge, which is what I had the time to do, their hearts were still far from God. They didn't care. And that's why I couldn't. I realized this later. Oh, you've got to reach the whole child. How can I, as the one outside the home, do that? It is the family that is best poised to do that, and it becomes up to the parent. And I know parents who are listening are like they feel like I can't do this, and I just want to look at every parent. I'm like, you can,
Right.
you can, because you can journey with your child, and you can do this together.
I mean, it is literally the commandment in Scripture that I just read. It is the parent's job.
It's almost like they want to. They see, like, you think of the whole Bible education or whole apologetics degree, and you just want to eat that whole thing at once and gain all that knowledge overnight. But what I found and what got me into apologetics is, like, I just met an individual that had questions, and we and him I became friends with him, and he just had these questions. So I'm like, okay, I didn't know at the time I was doing apologetics. I just was trying to answer his questions. So I researched. We would meet, we'd talk. He'd have questions I didn't have the answers to. I went home, found resources, studied them, so that the next time I met with him, let's go a little deeper. And eventually, over time, I was able to. He actually like led him to Christ, and I'm a big part of his whole conversion because I was just curious. I cared about him as a person. He was a good friend of mine, and I wanted to help where he seemed to be having trouble. And then I started. I'm another one of Thomas's students, and I started taking apologetics classes, and all the things that, because even as I work with the youth, like I can't address every single issue out there. Like I don't have the time for that, and I don't know, like, where do we start with every issue in the world? So I think that I usually kind of kick it to them, like, what kind of questions do you have? What kind of things do you have? Actually, this past week in one of the Bible classes at the school, the teacher brought me in to do a little kind of an individual panel, and I had some of the students just write down questions and ask me. And there's some questions that I answered there, and the rest I took with me. So I'm going to come together, and I'm going to compile some answers for them, and I'm going to be able to come back and give them something to look through and kind of digest. And they have some really good questions. And I think that's, I find that a lot of kids, the ones that are genuinely curious, that's we have to make sure, because a lot of kids are just genuinely curious. And if somebody's going to tell them that, they shouldn't be curious, it's going to draw them away. And like you were saying, earlier, if these kids are genuinely curious, we're like, oh, you don't even should have those thoughts. You shouldn't, that's dirty. You shouldn't think about that way. Just believe the Bible. These kids are just going to be they're going to start questioning it. It's like, is this actually true? They seem really scared about.
Well, I think it's more than just kids, right? I think that's all of us.
Yeah.
I mean, the question kind of presents itself as, are we allowed to have doubts? I know
that's good too.
I know as pastors and people talking here into these mics, we're probably not supposed to say yes to that. But there are times when each and every one of us, I'm not even going to ask you guys, have had doubts, and you've had to research and really dive in. If we who have spent this much time of our lives, this many years, this much effort, have still a doubt has surfaced that we've had to work through in our faith, what do you think these children are facing?
Exactly.
And so if we just shut them down
Exactly.
and say, just just pray about it, just read the Bible, just believe that, you know, what are we gonna, we're just going to drive them away. And so we kind of jumped right into apologetics, because the question is, you know, should we teach children to defend the faith? I think the resounding answer to that is yes. How does that tie into virtue in and of itself?
The biggest, most immediate place is intellectual virtue, that you have to have a mind that can receive the truth. So this is why I teach logic. I think every person should have training in logic, how to use the mind that God has given you. That it's not just like mathematical exercises. That's what modern symbolic logic is. So to be clear, for all those that are listening and pick up a book, symbolic logic is nothing but playing with symbols. It's not actually connected with the real world. But the classical logic that wants to understand what things are and to speak truly of them and to reason about them well, that's a skill. That's intellectual virtue. You also have to have a sense of prudence in how to approach some of these questions, that some questions probably shouldn't be approached too early.
Right.
You know, that even as a youth pastor, when I got younger kids,
Well, I mean,
we're not
I don't know how
going
many times to say it. Age appropriate.
yeah, we're not going to go
Yeah.
into certain things, and you have to have some wisdom as you approach this, and there is a sense of fortitude, of courage, that as you dive in, you may not know what you're getting into. And I think to really wrap it up, the virtue of prudence, one of the key aspects that come out of that is the virtue of deliberation, where you know how to take counsel. So I think it's worth mentioning when people are like, well, where do I go? Where do I find this stuff? On our website, we have partner ministries and we have resources that we point towards. So things like, and there's previous episodes we've done with Apologetics SA in Pretoria, South Africa, that we partner with. Ratio Christi, which is worldwide. We did interviews with some people down in Potch and in Pretoria, but there's Ratio Christi for us here in North Carolina down the street.
Right.
It's all over. And so they've got resources, and a lot of this stuff is free, and people aren't aware of this. And so even some of the bigger names, like if you have like Alyssa Childers, Frank Turk Ministry, these are well trusted, well-worn resources that, you know, have stood the test of time. That these are things that you can go to. They're solid, they're biblical, they're from people who have proven themselves over time to be trustworthy.
So with all of that said, I'm going to get to go first, so I'm going to take the easy one. But if you guys were to recommend one book to parents to get started, to say, okay, like if they're just sitting here going, I have no idea how to teach my children to defend the faith, if you could pick one book, what would it be? I'm going to go with I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, because it's the book that we were forced into at the beginning, but realizing it is such a solid argument for the truth of Christianity completely. If you had to pick one other book, what would you choose?
I would say Aquinas' Summa.
Okay, without the pretentiousness and without, you know, we all know you're smart. So if we're talking to parents out there who
I'm
say
kidding.
say the thing of, I don't know how to do this.
Well,
I
mark
don't
that
have
as a
enough faith to
favorite,
be
but
an
that's not where you
atheist.
start.
Yeah.
So
What would be
work
the
your
one
way up
book
to
you
that.
would choose?
I'll go with I've enjoyed what Hillary Ferrer does with her Mama Bear apologetics.
I'm so glad you chose that one, because if I didn't pick I Don't Have Enough Faith, that would have been my...
Hillary
that would've been it.
Ferrer and her ministry in terms of moms, like it's called Mama Bear Apologetics for a reason. She writes this,
Yeah.
and I encourage it. And she's got,
And I read it. I mean, I read it too. Like,
Yeah.
it's a solid book.
I think she might have
great.
podcasts and other material,
She's got, like, a lot of
other
stuff.
things that
Yeah,
she's
yeah.
doing. Can't recommend it more. So that would be a
and
go-to.
Lisa Childers has a good book called Another Gospel,
Mm-hmm.
and I like that. I've read that a couple of years ago, and she gets into some of the classical apologetics, not in like the complete order like you would get into. Not I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, but she does hit upon all of those things in her own quest. And I think what's great about those, both Hillary and Alyssa, right? Alyssa, is that they're kind of just, they were curious.
So we have Alyssa Childers, Another Gospel,
Yep.
Hillary Ferrer.
Ferrer. We got
Mama Bear Apologetics,
Mm-hmm.
Frank Turk and Norm Geisler, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist.
And I'm going to offer one honorable mention, because you mentioned at the beginning, about apologetics being all this arguing. James Sire, who's passed away just recently, wrote a book called A Humble Primer on Christian Apologetics.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one too.
Several of my students have recommended that if you really want to understand what apologetics is
Yeah, yeah.
and how that works, clear up some of these misconceptions.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Incredible resource.
All right, gentlemen. Well, as always, I appreciate the conversation. You can find our podcast, Virtuous Roots, on all streaming platforms and our website, familiesofvirtue.com. God bless, and we'll talk to you next time.